And
Okay, well, I wondered if would you like me to give like a little reading to start? Because I think it kind of sets the scene of where we are. And if I can maybe just give you a little reading, then we can then sort of start to talk about what's going on.
that would be perfect. Yes, definitely. Okay.
Okay,
And
so I'll go from the kind of beginning of the book, and specifically, this is a letter, and it's obviously just it's how the book begins. So it's a letter from it's dated the 20th of September, 1589 at midday, and it's from Andrew Drummond, who's the harbour master at the Port of Leith, Scotland. A message most urgent to His High and Mighty Majesty King James VI of Scotland at Holyrood House. Sir, at 10 o'clock this morning, a Scottish ship returning from Norway docked at the Port of Leith. Its crew say they almost perished in a tempest raging in the German Sea. They witness vessels of the Danish fleet, which is conveying your intended bride, Her Royal Highness the Princess Anna of Denmark, to Leith Port, struggling in the weather. The storm has been so violent that the Danish fleet has dispersed, and a distress signal of 3 cannon shots was heard from the Gideon, the ship carrying the Royal Princess. But the conditions were too dangerous to help, and the Gideon disappeared in a great mist. There have been no confirmed sightings of the Gideon since then, and there's now some great concern for all souls on board. I remain your Majesty's servant and will provide further news as soon as I hear it. So to set the scene on that was a letter about a storm. And that storm was a storm that I think changed the course of history, because at that point, people were starting to believe that witches could perform weather magic. King James of Scotland believed that that storm was actually a spell cast by those who didn't want the royal marriage to go ahead, and they didn't want him on the throne. So just as he's waiting for this news of his new bride, Anna of Denmark, there's just this huge disaster. So the King's Witches, for anybody who's not familiar with it, it's a story about 3 women who find themselves at the heart of the first witch panic in Britain. As I said before, I write historical novels. And what they do have in common is this: the fact, well, they're all set in Scotland, but they're all these retellings of real events, but they're done specifically through the eyes of the women who were at the heart of them. The King's Witches is set at the North Berwick witch trials in the late 16th century. And I was just so fascinated by this, because I didn't know very much about witch trials when I started to kind of look at the book, and I knew quite a lot. There was quite a lot of fiction being written about the kind of witch trials in England. But the North Berwick witch hunts were actually, I believe, influenced by the witch hunts that were going on just kind of at that time in Scandinavia and Germany. It's my understanding, and I'm probably be corrected on this, but I think that Scotland and Britain always had witches. So there was always people who were probably on the kind of edges of society, but they were a part of everyday life. Some of them were healers, thought themselves to have magical powers. So these were just kind of ordinary people. But the tone of the witch hunts in Germany was different, because they were part of a kind of general religious persecution. And that was a purge against Protestants, Jews, witches. And the key difference with those trials and with what had already been happening in Britain was that practicing sorcery was also being seen as being in a pact with the devil or with demons. The kind of spells that these witches were accused of doing were much wider, on a much wider scale. So they involved things like flying through the air, creating weather magic, and creating storms or sea conditions that would drown people. So that was really different from the kind of little charms and spells of the everyday folk that were happening already in Scotland. And when King James heard that Princess Anna's ship was in danger and it had turned back, he actually had to go and set sail to rescue her. They were actually, Anna and James were actually legally married at this point, even though they had never met, because he sent an envoy to Denmark to marry her. He sent one of his ambassadors to marry her as a kind of proxy. Because he didn't want to leave Scotland at that time. I think he was nervous about leaving Scotland at that time. You know, there was lots of paranoia going on. So when he made this voyage to go and find her, it was a huge act of kind of courage and bravery for him to do that. When he landed in Scandinavia and found the royal fleet, it was this huge kind of diplomatic embarrassment for the Danish admiral because he had kind of failed to bring Anna across successfully. And so he blamed weather magic because there was sort of, you know, that was the kind of, as I've explained, this kind of like idea that was already happening over there. So he introduced this idea of the storm being so extraordinary that it must have been caused by some kind of spell. And this idea was new to James. But he at that time, you know, was paranoid about his own security on the throne because of the threat from his cousin Earl Bothwell. And there was also no heir to the English throne at this point. So he stood a chance of getting that. He did in the end, but he certainly was kind of aware of that at the time. So that storm was the perfect storm. Because when James came back to Scotland, there were already women in Denmark who were being interrogated for causing the storm. These were women in Copenhagen who were already on the radar of the authorities there for being troublesome, for being witches, and they were tortured. And when they were tortured, they confessed, and they said they'd been in a plot with witches in Scotland. So James took the idea of witches plotting back to Scotland with him when he returned. And there were simultaneously, I think, events happening in North Berwick at the time involving people being accused of witches. And they ended up, you know, everybody ended up being interrogated under torture and confessing. So this was, you know, a wide scale event and the first of its kind in Britain. And it prompted James to write a book, I think we all know this one, called Demonology, which was this kind of witch hunter's Bible. And it was used by people like Matthew Hopkins, the witch finder general. So the King's Witches, which is my version of events, just follows the story from the perspectives of three women who were kind of involved. So I really wanted to talk from Anna's point of view, and I also wanted to give the point of view of a North Berwick witch. And I wanted to bring another character in who would perhaps link events a little bit, and she is Kirsten. She is actually Anna's lady in waiting, and she has to come with Anna on the trip for diplomatic reasons. She speaks English, and we find out a little bit more about her kind of involvement in the story as we go. So my fictional story, it follows Anna's arrival in Scotland, which is basically into this dark world. There's huge mistrust, there's fear, she's a foreigner, she has to navigate the Scottish court at Holyrood House, and she has to obey their rules. The main rule that I've given her is that if she doesn't produce an heir within a year, she faces being banished back to Denmark, where she'd have to live out the rest of her life in a convent in shame. So I've given Anna quite high stakes there. She has to be a really good royal bride. But of course, my Anna is she's a naive young woman. She has her own kind of thoughts and views about things. And when she meets the Scottish group, then she also meets a very handsome young man called Henry, Lord Henry, and he's a courtier. And unfortunately, she falls in love with him. So things take a different turn for her, a completely different, unexpected turn for her. Then we meet Jura. So she is my kind of version of Gillis Duncan, who you'll know from the North Berwick witch trials. She's a servant with healing powers. She can do love spells. She's your Scottish witch that I talked about earlier. She could do luck charms. She can help alleviate people's sicknesses. But the problem that Jura has is that her master, Master Seaton, wants to have his way with her. And when she refuses him, he uses her powers, his knowledge of what she's doing, against her and accuses her of being a witch. And she flees to Edinburgh, which is just a massive mistake because she ends up being caught and imprisoned in Holyrood House. Our third character, Kirsten, who's the lady in waiting to Princess Anna. So Kirsten's Danish, but she has a history in Scotland and she speaks the language, and that's why she was chosen. But Kirsten has got her own very desperate reasons for wanting to be in Scotland, and she has links to the Scottish witches herself. So all three women find themselves under threat and they have to rely on each other to survive. So The King's Witches is a story about persecution and female strength at a time in which women, even those in the most high profile positions, had very little power. You can tell Anna's based on a real person because, and obviously Jura is based on Gillis Duncan, who was one of the first people to be accused of witchcraft in North Berwick. And it was under her account, in her account under torture, that a number of people were obviously named. And I wondered if I might just do a little bit of Jura, because she's, obviously she's our Scottish witch. So it's quite nice if I can just read a little bit from where we kind of meet her. So there's a nice extract that I like to do when we meet Jura, and she's just about to start her new job with the new family. And this is when she meets her master for the first time. I've called him Seaton in this, but it's actually Kincaid because I changed the name, so forgive me for that one. So he's Master Kincaid, but he's based on Seaton in the actual events. It takes 3 raps of the Kincaid's brass door knocker before anyone comes, and I'm beginning to lose my nerve. The front garden is walled and filled with tall, shady trees that nod down at the village, most pleased with themselves. I haven't been in a nice house before, and I'm worrying if I should take off my pattens when the door swings open, and I'm faced with a short man with curly silver hair and a red bulbous nose, upon which are balanced a pair of eyeglasses slightly askew, giving his face the appearance of a set of weighing scales. No vagrants, he says, adjusting his spectacles. There are alms down at the kirk, and you should take yourself there before I have you whipped for trespassing. I'm not a vagrant, sir, I say. I'm Mistress Jura Craig, come at the goodwife's summoning, to work as your new maid. The man runs his fingers over his moustache. My new maid, he says slowly. He takes off his eyeglasses and lets his gaze slide over me. You look like a beggar. I most certainly am not, sir, I tell him. I'm from down in North Berwick village, and I've never begged in my life. Have I seen you in kirk, he asks. I'm there every week, I say, and so are you, Master Kincaid, as I always see you in the front pew, worshipping God Almighty in the most devout way, as I do myself. He looks satisfied at this and stands back, allowing me into the cool, dark hallway. The rush mats are clean and the air has the faint scent of lavender, but I don't see any, nor any ornaments or pictures at all, save for a single small looking glass hung by the door. This is a house without fripperies. The maid's chamber is on the top floor, he says. I'll take you up. The mistress and Hazel are down in the town, and Lord knows when they'll be back. I don't know what masters should and shouldn't do with their maids, which is why I don't tell Bailey Kincaid that I'll wait for them to get back, or ask him to go and find cook. Instead, I let Bailey Kincaid show me up to my chamber, and that's when the trouble with him starts. So that's Dura getting herself into all sorts of trouble. The idea that Scotland was full of witches and that witches here were largely women. I think the outnumbered accused men 5-1. I find that really fascinating. And I think you'll be familiar with the research that the University of Edinburgh's done just into the extent of the witch hunts here. So I'm very familiar with North Berwick. I'm not very familiar with any of the other ones. I think the idea of women as witches took off specifically in Scotland because of how religious a place it was. I would be interested to kind of discuss around that. James was influenced by John Knox, and women were seen as weaker and more susceptible to wicked influences and potentially dangerous. I actually was given a book for my 50th birthday by my partner, and it's John Knox's book so John Knox was particularly against women in power. He'd actually had trouble getting an audience with Mary Queen of Scots, and he had a difficult relationship with Queen Elizabeth I, and he wrote a book called and it was a diatribe against women in power. And it's called The First Blast of the Trumpet Against the Monstrous Regiment of Women. So that really kind of set the tone for how women were seen at that time. Certainly not to be, they were seen as dangerous if they were in power. And I think it's always good to remind ourselves of demonology. The bit that I've got here, just to give you an idea of how that kind of ideology kind of moved through the different texts. What can be the cause that there are 20 women given to that witchcraft, when there is one man? The reason is easy, for it's that sex is frailer than man is, so it's easier to be entrapped in these gross snares of the devil, as was overwell proved to be true by the serpent's deceiving of Eve at the beginning, which makes him the more familiar with that sex since that time. So demonology was intended to convince skeptics of the reality of witchcraft, and it's written in this kind of form. I don't know if anybody's read it, probably, but it's written in this form of this dialogue. It sets out an argument demonstrating that the existence of witches can be proven, and it urges their detection and punishment. Although the Scottish Witchcraft Act had been enforced since 1563, no large-scale witch hunts took place until the period during which James was writing, unless anybody knows better. There was probably other reasons why women were persecuted, so we know that there would have perhaps been, I think there's this kind of idea that it's a woman on the periphery of society who's a healer, but I also believe that there were women who perhaps there were economic reasons as well. I think that might have been the case for some of the Copenhagen witches. Some of these women were actually quite wealthy, they had land, and it was basically a land grab on some of them. And there was also this kind of power struggle between the Catholic and the Protestant churches at the time over which was the true religion, and targeting the devil through targeting witches was one of the ways the Kirk could show its power, and torture could be used as a method of interrogation because witchcraft was seen as being a crime against God. so you're probably aware of the Edinburgh University interactive map, and I was looking at witches who were near me, and there was actually a few sort of in sort of Calder, because I'm in Edinburgh. There was a few in Calder, and there was one sort of just on the outskirts of Edinburgh, who's actually came from Clifton Hall, Euphami McCallion, but she got caught up in the North Berwick witch trials as well, even though she didn't live there, because she was related to one of the main North Berwick witch hunters, David Seaton, who was Gillis Duncan's employer. And Euphemia was wealthy, and she had inherited a lot of wealth, more than Seaton's side of the family had. And I think what happened was that Seaton put Euphemia's name to Gillis Duncan when she was being interrogated, and that's how Euphemia got accused as well. Euphemia was executed at Castle Hill. King James gave her estate at Clifton Hall to one of his favourite courtiers, and she also had a house on the High Street that James gave to one of his officers. So like the land grab situation there. The North Berwick witch hunts. I've got the numbers there. About 60 people. Accusation, arrest, and torture of about 60 people. Some of them people were educated and of a high status within the community, and under torture and questioning, many people confessed. And although the records are, incomplete, it's likely that many of them were executed probably by burning. I don't know whether you've got more detailed information on that. I suppose to kind of summarize kind of what kind of where I'm coming from again. I think the reason why I really wanted to write about the North Berwick witches was the same reason why I was inspired to write my first novel, Maiden. The Maiden is a retelling of a local murder in Corstorphine, where I live, which has always kind of been part of the folklore, kind of demonising the woman who was the murderess involved, without really going into the whys and wherefores of why that crime happened. I suppose I felt there was something about the story of the Maiden, certainly, that lacked insight into the people that were at the centre of it. For the King's Witches, I specifically felt that the North Berwick trials were the trigger point for Britain's witch panic. I'm not the first author to write about them. Obviously, you'll be familiar with books like The Burnings, but I was particularly interested in Anna of Denmark because she was 14 when she actually was betrothed to King James and came over here. But actually, they went on to have a very successful marriage. They produced a number of children, and the marriage lasted for quite a long time. But when we look at Anna, when you sort of do a light search on Anna of Denmark, what I found was coming up was a lot of stuff about the storm, obviously, but there was a lot of stuff coming up about the fact that she loved to watch theatre. She loved to wear great farthingale gowns, and that was like it. And I felt that Anna was kind of slightly underplayed by the historians. Again, I thought, if you've made this huge journey, you've married James, who's probably, I mean, it must have been quite a difficult man to be married to, even though it was a royal marriage. There was still, there was still a couple. I thought there was something heroic about her, actually. Although I've kind of played around with her actual involvement in the plots. I specifically, so I think maybe where the King's Witches for me differs as a novel, none of the people in my book can actually do magic. There's no spells that work. They think they work. Obviously they do believe that. But I was very careful that these were real women who got caught up in kind of like real life events. So that's kind of my my kind of take on it. I'm happy to do another reading if anybody wants one, but I would be really interested to have a discussion or to kind of go into the the kind of my idea that the North Berwick witch trials were the trigger point. And there's an amazing academic text. I'm going to just reference it to you now. Where is it? Oh God, it's not here. Where is it here? It's not here. So, oh, that's because they've put. Oh, I see what's happened. I'm looking at the end of the King's Witches, and I'm thinking it feels like it's actually ending in the middle of a chapter, and they made a mistake. But it's because they put a little bit of my third book in the end. Sorry about that. I'm completely confused by that. So, there's an amazing. Yes, this is it here. So, there's a piece of historical research. By a scholar called Liv Helen Williamson of the University of Tromsø, and it's called Witchcraft Against Royal Danish Ships in 1589 and the Transnational Transfer of Ideas. So that was really got the idea, actually the sort of idea of witchcraft coming from Scandinavia to Scotland. So if anybody wants to look that up, it's a very interesting piece of research.